worship on Sunday morning gathers the people of God from all over the city. It draws them in, and it draws their lives to God. Like it pulls us towards God. It calls us to bring our lives to him. That's what good worship does. And then good worship also scatters. It sends us out. It propels us back into the world. And it sends us with power and with a story and with a sense of mission. And we as workers out in the world really need that. We need that rhythm of 6 days out and 1 day in, 6 days out and 1 day in.
Our guest on this episode of the Reintegrate podcast is Dr. Matthew Kaemingk of Fuller Theological Seminary, where he serves as Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Christian Ethics. His latest book is amazing, co-authored with Calvin Seminary Professor Corey Wilson. It's titled Work and Worship, Reconnecting Our Labor and Liturgy, published by Baker Academic. Matthew earned his Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and holds a doctoral degree in Christian ethics from Fuller Theological Seminary and systematic theology from the Free University of Amsterdam. He, his wife, Heather, and their 3 sons live in Houston, Texas. This book is about worship as it relates to work, which is a whole new angle, right?
Yeah, it's been pretty encouraging to hear feedback from pastors around the country, worship pastors and people leading in the faith and work movement, different centers for faith and work in LA and Tennessee and Chicago and New York and Denver and, lots of fellows programs, that kind of stuff.
Oh, this is Brendan.
All right. Hey.
Brendan was a student leader for me in CCO, and now he's in work. And so he wants to be the best at what he does and doing it for the glory of God. And this whole idea of worshiping while you work.
Yeah, just like Bob taught me, fly under the radar, collect a paycheck.
That's what I taught you.
Go home.
That's what I taught you.
Retire, die. So for a first question for you, your book, Work and Worship, what was the reason, kind of the specific need you and Dr. Corey Wilson were trying to address in writing the book?
Corey and I, we've both been active in this faith and work space for a long time, which, working alongside professionals who work in the marketplace, and also alongside churches and pastors who really have a heart for marketplace leaders, who ministries that want to equip Christians to live out the gospel, not just in their private life, but in their working life as well. And through conversations over the years, we routinely received questions from pastors who were trying to really connect Sunday morning worship to people's working lives. What do the rituals we do on a Sunday morning have to do with our working rituals on Monday morning? And really trying to bridge that gap, that sort of haunting chasm. And then as we talk with workers, we really got the sense that they felt like they were living 2 separate lives. They have their Sunday life and they have their Monday working life. And it didn't feel healthy or good for them. The way we say it in the book is they're living their lives in pieces, and separated from one another, the pieces begin to die. Work begins to feel more and more fruitless, and worship begins to feel more and more disconnected and sort of unreal or unrealistic. And so really this book came out of a desire to serve both the pastors and the professionals in our lives who really wanted to weave these things back together. The way we're living in modern life is essentially not a biblical way to live. The ancient Israelites and the early Christians were called to love God with their whole mind, body, soul, and spirit, and their whole week was meant to be marked by a holiness. And so really that's what we're getting after in this book, is what would it look like for churches as a whole community to start to make these deeper connections between Sunday and Monday.
That's a really good point, and I would say really good insight overall. Obviously, that's kind of the focus of a huge amount of the work that Bob does, and ways that he tries to reach out to various churches, college students, and so forth, because this is an issue that I think at least the church in America has taken way too long to address.
Yeah, and maybe just like a more personal story of something that sort of haunts me personally. So when I was a kid, my mother was a nurse. She worked, regularly at the hospital caring for mothers and babies. And my dad was a carpenter. He had a cabinet shop, and he hired guys from around the town to work on cabinets and to learn carpentry skills. And Sunday after Sunday, my mother and father would go to church, and they would pray for missionaries, and they would bless the youth team, and they would hear, testimonies from missionaries and Christian nonprofits. And we even had a map with all of our nonprofits that we supported and all of our missionaries that we supported. But never once was my mother brought forward, with all the nurses. Never did we pray for her in her mission at the hospital, and never did we pray for my dad's business. And my mom's hospital was not on the mission map. My dad's cabinet shop wasn't on the mission map. So the church may have said, in a sermon, your work matters to God, but its worship didn't reflect that. Its worship told my parents that they just work, and the people who truly do the work of God are the youth mission team that goes for a week somewhere and builds a house. But when my dad builds cabinets for your home, that's just work. That's not mission. And so if we say that all of our vocations matter to God, if we say that we believe in the priesthood of all believers, if we say that all of this is a part of the kingdom, then our worship should reflect that.
Most people you talk to, unless they have been exposed to kind of this growing wave of integrating faith and work, and this wave of thought that you're working in and that Bob's working in, most people are like, yeah, I've never thought about this. Most people are like, yeah, my work is my work. Most people in your church will feel that way. So in your book, you write, this book aims to articulate a vision for worship that is vocationally conversant. What do you mean by that? Because to me, that just sounds like Bob speak.
So I live in Houston, which is an oil and gas town. And so when the oil price goes up, people lose a lot of money here. People lose their jobs. Sometimes people lose their homes. So it's a big deal in the oil industry here in Houston. If the price of oil goes down like it has over the last year, that affects everyone. Now, that's on people's minds and hearts when they go into worship on a Sunday morning here in Houston. And for worship, never to mention that, never to bring that in prayer, means that it's not conversant with the city. Or let's say you're in a farming town and you have a terrible drought and everyone is losing everything, right? And you don't pray about that on a Sunday morning. You don't name that. You just keep singing praise songs like everything is fine. Vocationally conversant worship, worship that can have a conversation with our working lives, will actually invite the congregation to bring their economic heartbreaks and longings to God. So I'll give you, another example. I went into a church with an energetic young worship leader. He was excited to lead worship, and he said, as he's strumming his guitar, he says, "Guys, I know you've all had a really busy week. You've had a lot going on. You might have stress and strain, but for the next hour, we're just going to focus on Jesus." Now, he was well-meaning, but what he essentially said was, all that stuff that's been going on during the week for you in your work and your family life, that's not welcome here. This is a spiritual place where we focus on spiritual things. Now, he could have said, guys, I know you've all had a really crazy week. You've got a lot on your minds. You've got projects and homework and all these things going on. For the next hour, I want to encourage you to bring all of that to God. Lay that at his feet. So whatever questions, heartbreaks, if you have some victory you need to tell God about, tell him. This is the place. So that's the difference between vocationally silent worship and vocationally conversant worship, where Sunday morning becomes this place where we talk to God about our lives and our work, and it becomes a place that sends us back into our work to extend our worship. So that Sunday morning is not just sort of an hour of worship, but it is the beginning of a whole week of worship. So, as we send you out into the world, we're sending you to extend the grace and the gospel that you've received into the dentist's office and into the school and into your tire business and your mechanic shop. Extend these stories of grace, these patterns of mercy that you've received and learned, extend them to those you work with.
I underlined in the book, you said worship leaders should not be called worship leaders, it should be called worship starters. I loved that.
That's sort of a riff off of James K.A. Smith. And what he says is, if all of life is going to be worship, then the sanctuary is the place where we learn how. So it's sort of
right.
like it's a training ground where we learn the stories and the rituals and the patterns that we need to continue on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday.
Having been in this faith and work sphere for a while, it's so hard for me to talk to pastors and talk about the importance of vocation, because they say, okay, here's yet another program. I just kind of have to latch this on to my youth program and my missions program and my short-term trip to so-and-so and our serving with the partnership with the homeless shelter. This is just one of those other things you're asking me to put in. I really don't have the time for this. Why is it so important to the worship experience itself?
In many ways, I think that this understanding of worship and mission should relieve pressure on the pastors rather than put more on them. And I'll tell you why in a number of ways. But it is one thing to formulate a 6-week sermon series on faith and work. It takes a lot of pastoral work to do that. But you can do it. You could read a stack of books and your people might learn a few things and they might pay attention to some of it and it might even impact some of their lives. But once again, if you were to ask my mother and 5 other nurses to come forward one Sunday morning and have the elders come up and pray for them, they'll never forget that for the rest of their life. And that's a very easy, simple thing to do. You don't have to start a program. You don't have to lead a book club. But really through worship, this can just become a part of the DNA of your church. It's just what we do. We pray for workers and we bless them. And, we offer times for workplace testimonies where they talk about what God is doing in the workplace. But furthermore, when you start to see the workplace as a mission field, it's less important as a pastor that you recruit workers into your mission and all of your programs, and instead you equip them to be on mission where they already are. So oftentimes pastors really exhaust themselves trying to recruit workers into their programs and their mission volunteer activities at the church building, as opposed to finding ways to equip and bless and send them to the places where they already are.
In my research, I interviewed pastors around the country about what worked in their discipleship programs where they made vocation central to everything that they do. And over again, I heard the biggest thing that changed our church was having testimonies about work, was having times throughout the year where we prayed and we commissioned people into these various vocations. And one pastor said, we've actually grown as a congregation because of that. And people have actually told me the reason I'm here is because I have never seen that in any other church. These people actually care about what I do in my life.
Oh, well, that's great. And I wish I would have had that information when I was writing the book. It's great to have some evidence to back up these claims.
I mean, I can think of both of what you're saying, Matt, and what Bob just said, that people remember when you acknowledge the work that they're doing and the life that they have in their work. Because, if you're talking just chronologically, the amount of time, work is a huge part of everyone's life. My dad works at the Cleveland Clinic, actually. So main campus in Cleveland, one of the biggest hospitals in the world. He's a genetic researcher, and he works with people from all around the world. He's one of the only, he jokes that he's, unlike his whole floor, like the only white American-born man on the whole floor of dozens and dozens of people, because there's just people from all over the world, Indonesia, Singapore, Pakistan, China, everywhere, and he has a huge passion for that, though. He loves those people. And he loves getting to learn about their cultures and just about their beliefs and their faith and everything. And I think he has always viewed that in a big way as part of his mission. I remember about a year ago, he was getting to know one of the pastors at our church, because, there's multiple. He struck up a conversation with this pastor one Sunday, and somehow work came up. That pastor ended up meeting my dad one day up at his work, up at the clinic. And, during my dad's lunch break or whatever, they just talked, and my dad walked him around the campus and the places where he works and just told him about all these people. And I think he might have even introduced him to some people. And that just had my dad on another level for such a long period of time, because that was, I think, so validating for him to realize that what I'm doing here does matter, and the people I interact with every day here do matter. And bringing my faith here every day does matter.
Brandon, I think that's a wonderful story, because it highlights a core pastoral practice that seminaries just do not teach. And this is, I'm a professor at a seminary, at Fuller Seminary. I'm teaching a faith and work class, and you better believe I will teach this. It's just basic pastoral practice that you go to your people. And the pastoral practice of eating lunch in the workplace of your people, of course, pre and post pandemic time, going to their workplace, asking them real questions about it, and having real respect and curiosity and learning to ask just really basic questions. So where do you find delight and excitement in your work? What's breaking your heart or frustrating you? What are you asking God for in this workplace? And really the core pastoral practice is not fixing things or answering theological questions, but the ministry of presence and helping them reflect theologically on what is God doing here, because workers they're on a mission field, and they are the ones who know that workplace better than anyone. As a young pastoral intern, my first position was in Manhattan at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in their Center for Faith and Work. And I was tasked to be, a pastor to professionals. Many of them were working on Wall Street. And it was quite something to learn about their work and the difficult questions and challenges that they faced. And I didn't talk with them with this sense that I knew everything, but more that I was curious as to what God was doing and to what the enemy was doing, and to how I might pray for them. And I think sometimes pastors are nervous because they're not a part of these industries, and so they're sort of off of their playing field, right? They feel pretty confident when they're in the church building because we're talking about biblical exegesis and they know how to do that. Right. But in a mechanic shop, they're out of their element a bit.
I love those three questions you asked, because you don't have to be an expert in accounting or law or medicine in order to ask those questions. You just have to listen.
Yeah, and those are very basic questions, but they lead to very deep theological conversations, because where your delight is really sort of like, what has God made you to do? And how is this connecting with your unique personality made in the image of God? Then what's breaking your heart is really getting the worker to reflect on sin and injustice and dysfunction and the ways in which work is filled with thorns and thistles of the fall. And then what are you praying for is just sort of like, what sort of redemption or healing are you asking God to enact here? And how might you be a part of that healing and redemption in this little space? So the questions follow the biblical movement of creation, fall, and redemption.
You've never heard about that, have you, Brendan? Creation, fall, redemption.
What are you talking about? I was always just taught that it's the fall.
That's it.
Life bad, people bad.
I often tell pastors, hey, if you visit people in their workplaces, guess what? You'll never be at a loss for sermon illustrations.
Absolutely. And really the fundamentals of your sermons will change because
Absolutely.
you know what your people are going through, and you'll be able to connect more with your people, and you'll know how to pray for them in ways that are deeper and more meaningful. And your prayers won't be so vague.
Right. Visitation used to be like a major part of pastoral work. And I know when I went to seminary, we talked about a little bit, when someone's sick, you go to see them in the hospital, but there's visitation that could be happening all over the place. You could be visiting people in their homes and finding out what they're really struggling with in their families. You could be visiting them in their neighborhoods and finding out what is happening in your neighborhood. Visiting them at work is a huge one because they're spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week with these people in that workplace. And they don't know how the work itself is actually mission. How is the work itself worship?
Yeah, so this is really rooted in our understanding of what's going on in Genesis 1 and 2 and who Adam and Eve were created to be. There in the garden, work and worship were one thing. You were communing with God while you were gardening, right? That Adam and Eve are walking and talking with God. There was no division of activities. And furthermore, Old Testament scholars tell us that really we should understand the Garden of Eden as the first temple. And Adam and Eve are the first priests of that temple. They're called to guard and keep the temple of the Lord, which is where the presence of God rests, in the same way that Israel's priests were called to guard and keep Solomon's temple. And so if Adam and Eve are priests, then their work within the temple is to cultivate this sort of garden temple. Then their work with the land is itself an act of worship. God delights in it. And we see throughout the Old Testament people engaging in this very curious process by which they take the work of their hands and they lift it up to God, or they just incinerate it in a fire and the smoke goes up. And in the Old Testament, it says this very curious thing that the smell, the aroma goes into God's nostrils. And we often think of God having eyes watching us at work, but we don't often think of God having nostrils. For the people of ancient Israel, they understood that God delighted in their work so much that they could bring him their best cloth, their best calves, their best fruit and grain, and offer it to God in worship. And God would delight in that. And so they would very carefully select their very best products to carry directly into worship. And that was the way that they learned that God delighted in their work.
That's fascinating.
And I think you see it reflected in the New Testament, where we're told to love the Lord our God with all our mind, soul, body, and strength. And in Romans 12:1, to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is our spiritual act of worship. I see that just continuing in the early church, and we talk about this in the book on work and worship. That really these things are deeply united in Scripture, and the falling apart is more an issue of modern life. And the early church throughout the Roman Empire, they were bringing their products into worship regularly, and they had special prayers during the first few centuries of the church, blessings of workers and blessings of their fields and all sorts of things like that. So this whole faith and work thing is not a new fad. It's actually profoundly ancient. There are ways, like for a Labor Day service, you can actually have everyone in the congregation bring an item from their workplace and process forward and pile it up on the table and celebrate communion. Because communion itself, and we talk about this in the book, is an offering of our bread and our wine. These are things that we've made. We've taken the earth and we've fashioned it into bread, and we fashioned it into grapes and wine, and we offer that to God. And so we offer our work to God, and then God offers his work of salvation in the cross back to us in the communion table. But right there is an exchange of work, right? We're offering our work to him, and he's offering his work back to us. And so anyways, yeah, we can do special things that can remind us. One thing that I did when I preached just a few weeks ago on this topic was I had people write down things from their working lives that they wanted to offer God. So triumphs, victories, bonuses, promotions, heartbreaks, laments, requests, special confessions that they wanted to bring to God. But I had them write these things down on a piece of paper, and everyone had to process forward and offer something. And that was pretty meaningful. We also made a mission map. How I talked about that mission map, where we basically gave everyone a little thumbtack to put on the map of our city of Houston and wherever they worked. And they came up during worship, and they put a little thumbtack where they worked, so that we had a better understanding of where we were on mission throughout the city.
So subversive, you. So subversive.
What you mean to say, Bob, is that it's pretty punk rock. Synonym for subversive in Brendan's vocabulary.
It's very interesting. I'm reading your book, and you connect with J.J. von Allman and his metaphor of that worship is the beating heart of the church.
Yeah. So it has the heart has a gathering function and a scattering function. It pulls all of the blood in, and it sends all of the blood out. And that's what keeps us alive, that constant movement. And if the blood stops, then we're toast. And so the same is true with worship, that worship on Sunday morning gathers the people of God from all over the city. It draws them in, and it draws their lives to God. Like it pulls us towards God, and it calls us to bring our lives to him. That's what good worship does. And then good worship also scatters. It sends us out. It propels us back into the world, and it sends us with power and with a story, and with a sense of mission. And we as workers out in the world really need that. We need that rhythm of 6 days out and 1 day in, 6 days out and 1 day in. And that rhythm is really built into us as human beings. Like Sabbath matters, right?
So how can worship services in our churches fail us as Christians trying to live our lives faithfully in and through our work?
This is the part I'm excited about. So many grievances.
It can ignore our working lives. It can demean our working lives. It can, we use the word saccharine. It can be sugary happy. So it can sort of talk about the Christian life as everything is happy and awesome and nothing is ever hard or difficult. Worship can also fail by being very intellectual and abstract.
I'll tell you my most frustrating aspect of worship, and maybe Brendan will share his. Mine is what you call passive worship. It's like I've come to church and the show is up on the stage, the platform, but it's actually a stage. I'm like at a rock show, and I am just passively receiving. I am not participating.
Yeah, exactly. And if worship is a place where you're practicing, like where you're exercising and getting ready for the Christian life out in the world, and if you're just sort of slouched in your pew, you're not really working out any of your spiritual muscles. So you just come out sloppy. Brendan, what about you?
I mean, I told Bob I could probably fill up a couple podcast episodes about me just ranting my way through this list, but I'd have to say saccharine worship. I mean, there were so many times, especially for me during my formative years as a teenager and as a young adult, where there were just seasons that I was, pretty profoundly struggling with understanding my purpose, my spiritual worth, isolation, whatever. I mean, teenagers are miserable, so it's you fill in the blanks. But I was having a really rough go in that season of my life, and I would go to church every Sunday, and it was just like the same set of songs on our rotation, upbeat contemporary worship every single Sunday. It got to the point where I just completely disengaged from it. I wouldn't necessarily accuse a lot of the things that I see as insincere, disingenuous, but just not digging deep into the human experience the way that it should, the way that the Bible does, the way that the Psalms do.
Your story is not an odd one. It's a very common story for many young evangelicals. And I think there is a lot to be encouraged about in terms of the future of worship music. I think there's been a lot in the last 10 years, a lot more openness and exploration of lament and confession. There is a new album, as we talk about work and worship, there's a new album out by Porter's Gate, the Porter's Gate Worship Project. It's called Work Songs. You and your listeners can listen to it on Spotify. And it's just really phenomenal. Amazing, beautiful music on faith, work, and vocation. And it does not romanticize either faith or work. Yeah, so there's beautiful work in there. And they have a number of other albums as well that I would just commend to you. But yeah, Brendan, I'm sorry for that. I mean, that's a story that I share as well as a young evangelical growing up in the 90s.
Yeah, you probably had it worse than me.
Yeah, I sure did. So I feel you. I feel you, man. But there's good things out there.
Thanks for joining us, Matthew. I really appreciate it. Good to get to meet you.
Absolutely, guys. Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to subscribing to the podcast now and following you guys and seeing who else you bring in. And anyways, thanks so much for reading the book. I hope you guys enjoy it. And it was really fun. We didn't talk too much about Corey Wilson, my co-author, but he's a great guy at Calvin Seminary doing really good work. And his research on really interviewing workers about their heartbreaks and their own personal rituals is really cool. And anyways, I hope your listeners can pick up the book, and I hope they enjoy it. And we really wrote it for the church and hope that it's a blessing. So thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for being on the show, Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Reintegrate podcast with your host, Bob Robinson. That's me. And Brendan Romai. For the latest articles on reintegrating your callings with God's mission, online resources for further learning, how to get copies of the small group resource, a Bible study book I authored titled Reintegrate Your Faith with God's Mission, go to the webpage, re-integrate.org. Remember the dash. You can also find there the Reintegrate podcast page with other episodes and ways to email us to comment on this episode. That's re-integrate.org.